Speech Police and the dumbest bill in America. This is Mark Fisher with Mark and the Millennials and the Millennial. Joining me today is Garrick Ross.
Oh, I'm excited. We're talking about Amendment 1. We're talking about the foundation of the country.
Speech Police, man.
I am excited.
And of course, the dumbest bill in America. And we want to thank our assistant producer, Christopher Hopkins, and our producer, Adam Katura, who are with us here today. So first up, Speech Police, Morning Joe and Mika Brzezinski. On MSNBC, of course, there was this huge dust-up with Donald Trump. And the President of the United States very stupidly, yes, I did say that, very stupidly tweeted out that Scarborough had killed one of his aides who he was allegedly having an affair with some 19 years ago. The aide worked in Florida in Scarborough's district. A lot of people don't realize that Joe Scarborough was actually a United States congressman from Florida and that he was a Republican.
Yes.
And
a long time ago.
And it is true. One thing is true. He was having an extramarital affair. At least that was documented a number of different times. We don't know if he was having an affair with the staffer. What we do know for sure is the staffer at that time, 19 years ago, Lori K. Clausudis, she died mysteriously in that she had a heart condition.
Yeah.
She basically dropped dead from the heart condition, hit her head on the desk, and then thereafter ended up dying, of course. We're not sure. It basically was from the heart condition, not from hitting her head.
It was sudden. She was very young, and it was just, it's terrible, what happened to her.
It is. So, and there was all this talk for many years that Scarborough was having an affair with her, and that he had killed her because he was going to be outed by the press that he was doing this, an extramarital affair, particularly since he was a Republican. He was a conservative, at least that's what he led people to believe from Florida. There was no proof to that. But it didn't stop Donald Trump from tweeting that the facts are that Joe Scarborough probably killed his aide and that she didn't die from natural causes.
Yeah, and there's a line, Mark, and I know with Trump, he lives 2 steps over the line. And
he does.
And there's a lot of people that's fine, but this is like 12 steps over the line, and I don't really understand what it does for him beneficially.
It doesn't help him, I don't think, during a campaign.
He looks like an ass a little bit.
He does.
I'm gonna say it.
He does. He does.
And I feel bad for the husband because she was married at the time, and here it is 19 years later, and somebody's re-adjudicating his wife's death.
The someone being the president of the United States.
And that person is the most powerful man in the world.
Yes.
And it just looks bad. And look.
By the way, it is true though that Scarborough, 6 months after getting reelected to the United States Congress from Florida, so 19 years ago when he was reelected, 6 months thereafter, he did resign abruptly, and then not long after, of course, was
picked up
out with many different women.
Yeah.
So it is true. That part is true, and that's why there was so much talk about, well, was he also having an affair with Lori K.
Isn't that how he
Clausudis?
met Mika Brzezinski? Because the two of them are in a relationship, and he was married and then co-host.
And she was married with children, and so was he, and then they ended up being co-hosts, and they ended up getting married. So look, the fact that they're philanderers is no doubt about that. And by the way, the president's on his 3rd wife, so I mean, so there's that. But the fact of the matter is that he did tweet this, and so why are we talking about this? Well, we're talking about the speech police, this particular podcast, because Mika Brzezinski is basically saying, look, he shouldn't be allowed to do that, or if he does, then Twitter should ban him. They should delete his account, or there should be some sort of qualification there. Yeah. So what do you think about that?
It's tough because you got to balance 2 ideas here. One, absolute right to free speech, and I'm an absolutist when it comes to free speech. There's times in the Supreme Court's history where they put limits on free speech. For instance, you can't shout fire in a crowded theater. I'm of the Ayn Rand philosophy where I think there's a moral issue with putting that limitation on it, and that society should tell people that just naturally it's a bad idea to do that. But that's beside the point. But there's also the free speech implications of a private company, that they're allowed to regulate speech however they want. I think when you're the president of the United States, and regardless of what you say, and whether it's proverbially outlandish, whether you're a Republican or a Democrat, it should stand. It should be viewable. It is imperative that everybody has all the information necessary to interact with their politicians. and that applies
So
to the
look,
president.
Kara Swisher of the New York Times, she's a reporter and a writer. She writes in an editorial, and it's entitled "Twitter Must Cleanse the Trump Stain," and she suggests
Trump
that
stain.
Twitter could label tweets that Trump puts out as false and link a myriad of high-quality information that refutes Trump's tweets.
What is high quality
and his
information?
Exactly.
And this is the problem. This is why I
Exactly.
look, I understand a lot of the concern about some of the things that Trump says, especially.
First of all, we should say unequivocally, he should not have tweeted what he
absolutely
tweeted, right?
And this is
Because
what we mean when we say, there's things that just there's no point in him saying
it's
it.
why did he
Yeah.
do that? But we do actually, you know what?
But the problem is when you start regulating that speech, you start saying, what Donald said was wrong, let's start fact-checking it. You draw a line, right? And so now everything gets kind of held to that standard. The next tweet he says, when he's talking about a legitimate policy objective, that he has a specific, it's not right or wrong, especially when you deal with things like policy. There is no real right or wrong. And you're going to start getting these news outlets who have a different perspective on an issue than him that are going to start labeling. And I'm not saying that this is like nefarious or this is what's going to happen, but it is possible that you're going to get people who are going to say that this is misleading and wrong, and fact check something and write that it's wrong, despite it being an objective, truth.
So your point is that people should have the opportunity to think for themselves, become critical thinkers, and figure out what is right and wrong, but also do the research accordingly to decide whether it's right or wrong.
I would hope that people take that much attention to every issue that's important to them.
And unfortunately, of course, they don't, which is why so many on the left, because I do believe that many on the left they don't really research a lot of things that deeply, and so therefore they want to force feed information to people and say, you can't see anything else but what I'm showing you. And look, so Kara Swisher of the New York Times basically wrote that any future tweet from Trump, if it's false, according to Twitter, should be labeled as such, and there should be high-quality information that Twitter decides to include in terms of a link to say, hey, you want to learn the truth about this? Can you imagine? So really what we're saying is that we have free speech in the United States, except that the New York Times believes that free speech should be fact-checked every time you talk by having a link there, which in other words, the speech police, which is what we're talking about, are going to determine every time you say something whether it's true or not, and we know for a fact that, by the way, the truth serum should be included every time you say something in terms of a link. Can you imagine if that happened to you?
So Twitter, as a private company, is not publicly traded from I could be wrong about that, but they're a private company regardless. They're well within their right to do whatever they want, and that is fine. But there are consequences for the actions that they take. And the question really is in your mind, do you believe that Twitter is, a niche platform that is small, or do you believe that it embodies the public space? Is the internet and chat forums, are they really as private as we want to believe?
This really is, and quite frankly, it affects everybody, but millennials in particular, because you all grew up with Twitter, and
everybody's got 3 social media profiles.
Most baby boomers do not have a Twitter account. This is exclusively a millennial thing.
Yes.
And millennials, even for millennials who don't have a Twitter account, they most definitely follow Twitter. By at least going.
And the news covers Twitter,
Yes.
and you watch ESPN, non-politics related, and you get half the segments are to look at what this person tweeted or that person tweeted. And
Twitter is useful to be able to find a really fast-moving
thread,
ticker, if you will, or thread of what's happening in the world, and you can pick and choose what you want to read or not read. But of course, according to the New York Times, whatever you read, there should be a fact checker with a link there determining that and telling you that what you're reading isn't so, and they're going to redirect you to the right information as they deem.
Let's look at coronavirus as an example here about why fact checking can be a pain and why it can be very wrong. Early in the coronavirus, we'll call it the curve of events here. Early in the curve of events, a lot of people in the news thought that coronavirus was not going to be a big deal. A lot of very reputable news organizations and reputable scholars.
Especially in the month of January, and even the first 2 weeks of February.
So somebody goes and tweets and they say, hey, coronavirus is going to be a huge deal.
And people are going to die.
Twitter comes out and they want to fact check a claim like that. And they say, no, and here's our good sources as to why it's not.
And where does it redirect you?
And it redirects you to these incorrect articles.
Yeah, written by folks in China, of course in English, but probably written by the WHO.
Yes, but this is the dangers you run into when you start doing this policing of speech and articles and fact checking and things like that.
Determining what you get to see, or that you do get to see it, but that indeed it has to fact check there.
But,
they have to
but at the same time, Twitter could wake up tomorrow and they could do this and it would be in their purview, but are they willing to accept the likely consequences that'll come from that? I mean, there's definitely going to be, an economic impact as well, because, a lot of people are going to look at it and be like, maybe I don't want to do my business here on Twitter, but also, it's going to set a precedent in how we handle, regulating speech in tech platforms, which is something.
Well, the head of Twitter, the head of Twitter said that he was not going to ban the president, and he was not going to delete the tweet. So Joe Scarborough decides, he goes on MSNBC, and he decides to respond on his behalf with respect to the Trump tweet. And Scarborough compares himself to Seth Richards. Now, Seth Richards is the gentleman who worked at the DNC in 2016 and was shot in the back on the way home, allegedly leaving the DNC. And there are all these rumors and conspiracy theories, of course, that Seth Richards
was the leak to WikiLeaks.
Was the link to WikiLeaks. And to be fair,
there's a lot of questions still surrounding his death.
A lot of questions. And so Scarborough is saying, well, I'm just like him because they're kind of trying to keep these conspiracy theories alive and so forth. So he's trying to get everybody to feel sorry for himself. We have a clip on this, and here it is.
Seth Rich's parents, what they have had to endure, and what the Klasudises, the entire family, have had to endure for 19 years. It's unspeakably cruel for whether it's the president or whether it's people following the president. It is unspeakably cruel.
And made worse by Twitter.
These are not public figures, nor have they ever been public figures.
So here's so Scarborough has a point, but here's the thing. Joe Scarborough and Mika Brzezinski have, since 2016, talked about Russia collusion with the President of the United States. They have said that Donald Trump could be a Russian agent. They've made all kinds of incredibly false claims, including not just on air at MSNBC, but also on Twitter. And so it goes both ways, guys. I mean, yes, a president should not be doing this. He should not be calling out Joe Scarborough and a murder that happened 19 years ago and saying Scarborough was responsible for it. Essentially, that's what he's saying, right?
Yeah. It is kind of frustrating when we talk about the media a lot, because it's like, I think we always hit the same points, and it's frustrating to watch the media for a lot of these things you're saying. It's like, you make a point that the street works both ways, and I agree, but look at, the duties. It's just painful because it's like, one person goes low and then somebody else goes way lower. And it's just
always.
And we've got this denigration of the media and politics, and where everybody's thriving off of just negativity, and it's painful.
If MSNBC really wanted to take the high road, they would have Mika Brzezinski and Joe Scarborough together actually saying and talking about how during this opportunity when Trump tweeted this, saying, you know what, we realize we've made a mistake. We understand why the president's angry at us, and we made a mistake for the past 3+ years, whereby we called out the president saying he was a Russian spy, which of course is completely and utterly false. But would Twitter ever allow that information to be redirected if you put that out there? If you said, for example, if I tweeted today that the president of the United States was a Russian spy, would Twitter then include information that redirected you to a place that you could find out that there was an investigation that happened several years and it was proved to be utterly false? In fact, it was basically a scam and a scheme to overthrow the president of the United States. This is an interesting subject. I think it's clear that we have to say, from the Mark of the Millennials perspective, at least from my perspective, Mark Fisher here, that the President of the United States should not be tweeting this. It's stupid. It's a waste of his time.
Yeah.
And at the same time, Joe Scarborough and Mika Brzezinski, maybe if they actually were real journalists, they could start talking about the truth. I understand they're supposed to be entertainment hosts, kind of, sort of, but they're pretending to spew journalism, and they're giving a lot of misinformation to the viewers as well.
My one thing that I always come back to, though, is, well, I think it annoys me when the president does this, is I think as he breathes life into a lot of things that if he just didn't touch them or look at them, that they would just remain,
they'd go away.
Voices in the wind.
Absolutely.
And the things that Brzezinski and Joe Scarborough say, because quite frankly, I don't know a lot of people who watch them. MSNBC generally as a network doesn't have exponential ratings. And even when you talk about daytime cable news,
3.3 million viewers, I think, on YouTube.
In
those
the scope of a 330 million people country, it's a very small market of people, and you breathe life into these feuds, and people want to be like, "Oh, who's Mika Brzezinski and Joe Scarborough?" And so you build up their platform by engaging in these hypothetical arguments with people.
So the Wall Street Journal editorial board, to finish this little conversation here about Mika Brzezinski and Joe Scarborough, they wrote an editorial entitled "A Presidential Smear." The board said, "We don't write this with any expectation that Mr. Trump will stop. Perhaps he even thinks this helps him politically, though we can't imagine how. But Mr. Trump is debasing his office, and he's hurting the country in doing so." I agree with the Wall Street Journal on that.
Yeah.
And so Trump needs to focus on the country. We have an economy,
a coronavirus pandemic, a terrible economy. But man, Joe Scarborough probably killed his
Stop
aide.
watching MSNBC. There's the answer right there, because apparently hardly anyone else watches it too. Next up, Nancy Pelosi attacks the president personally for the second time in like a week or 2 weeks.
This is my favorite feud. This is like 3-year-olds on the playground slinging mud back and forth at each other.
And we're talking the speech police with this podcast because, if Nancy Pelosi is saying these terrible things about the president, and if Joe and Mika Brzezinski are doing that, and we're not, of course, in any way policing that, obviously it's because we have free speech. But Nancy Pelosi, she always goes low. She decides to attack him personally. And the first attack was about Trump being morbidly obese and how he shouldn't take hydroxychloroquine because it's dangerous for someone who's morbidly obese, as if she's a doctor.
It's comical because that is about, when I was 7, that's how we solved our disputes. You went to the playground and you called somebody fat.
That's right.
And it was a knockout punch. And here's a septuagenarian Speaker of the House of U.S. Representatives, and she's like, "Man, he's fat." As if she got him, man, she got him. Took care of it.
And the president's a New Yorker, so he by his very definition, his very inner being is to always hit back, which is why he gets himself in trouble. So here's Nancy Pelosi. Here's the clip of her calling him fat. Here it is.
He's our president, and I would rather he not be taking something that has not been approved by the scientists, especially in his age group and in his, shall we say, weight group, but is morbidly obese, they say.
So he's morbidly obese, as they say. And then the next dust up was Nancy Pelosi, just like a week later, says the president and all of his associates have doggy doo on their shoes because of his tweet about Mika Brzezinski and Joe Scarborough.
In dog poop.
That's right.
That is dynamic, Mark.
Exactly.
We're getting some great slander here.
Because just like you said with the kindergarten and grade school, it's like, you smell like you stepped in dog doo. And of course, the implication there is that you smell, right?
Yeah.
I mean, it's not that you, so it's kind of what she's saying. So we have that clip as well. And here is good old Nancy at it again.
You're asking me about the appropriateness of the actions of this president of the United States? So completely inappropriate in so many ways that it's almost a given. It's like a child who comes in with mud on their pants or something. That's the way it is. They're outside playing. That's what he comes in with doggy doo on his shoes, and everybody who works with him has that on their shoes too for a very long time to come.
Of course, if you're Nancy Pelosi and you represent San Francisco, you don't come in with doggy doo, you come in with human feces, because that's all over the sidewalks in San Francisco. Just saying.
Now, I have a thought on this. A lot of people think that this is just crazy Nancy being crazy Nancy. However, I would say that this is very methodical. This is a calculated approach to talking about Donald Trump in the news, because if there's something that if you watch and look around and you see how they consistently refer to the president, their general model of attack and how Trump refers to Biden as being old and senile is that it is Trump as a young petulant child in how he handles things. He throws temper tantrums and he gets angry.
And he's fat.
And so what she's trying to do is characterize him as a child. And continue to, hammer home this point that he is a young, petulant child. And so what you're seeing here is while we all think of this as, something that's very, off the cuff, I think a lot of this is very methodical, and I think Nancy knows what she's doing.
I think that's interesting. It's an interesting take. She just a couple of days ago, she called Trump a confabulator. Now I have to explain why she did this, because
that's a big word.
It is a big word.
I don't know what it means.
Mika Brzezinski and Joe Scarborough, of course, when Trump went after Joe Scarborough, and obviously Mika, and he said Joe Scarborough, may have allegedly killed his aide 19 years ago. Interesting thing about that is that obviously, notwithstanding the fact that it's false, what Trump did, and he shouldn't have done it. He shouldn't have tweeted that. Nancy came back and called him a confabulator because the press asked her. But first of all, I have to say this. A confabulator, here's how it is defined. It's to fabricate imaginary experiences to compensate for your loss of memory. So you're fabricating imaginary things that happen to compensate for your memory loss. Well, if there's anyone who has a loss of memory...
Sleepy Joe over there.
it's Sleepy Joe, but it's also Nancy Pelosi. So we have a clip on this. Here's what you have to listen. At the very beginning of the clip, she tries to come up with the word confabulator, which clearly her staff told her to use. But then she has to ask her staff, how do I say it again? Talk about memory loss. Here it is. Here's the clip.
What he plays to. There's a word somebody used to me. They said you would understand it better if you knew what a confabulator is. Confabulator? Confabulator is. Look up the word confabulator. Somebody just really doesn't even know what the truth is and just says anything. And because he says it, then he believes it.
That's right. So it's to compensate for loss of memory, which clearly Nancy has long since lost her memory because her aide is telling her how to say it.
It's too big of a word for her to pronounce on her own. Confabulator. Take that to your dictionary word of the day. Use it in words with friends.
So that's the dust up. So, I have no doubt that Nancy Pelosi is probably one of the most difficult people to get along with in government if you are her adversary. There's no doubt in my mind.
Oh, yeah.
And there's also no doubt in my mind.
It's
interesting, though, because the mainstream media is constantly blaming Trump for taking her on. And of course, he's called her plenty of names as well. But lately, she's really going all at it. And I agree with you, Garrick. Maybe it's just as simple as the fact that she's trying to show that not just that he's a child and petulant, but perhaps maybe he has memory issues as well. I think it's very coordinated.
Yeah, I really do think that she is going to bat for Joe Biden. I think that she is going to be his chief surrogate, and she's going to do everything she can with her platform to define the narrative around Trump. And I think, this isn't something that's going to take, root in middle America and, independence. I think this is to energize the base.
Couldn't agree more.
She's the person who really speaks to that.
And what I think is interesting is that Joe Biden might actually choose Stacey Abrams as his vice president nominee.
If you asked me a week ago, I would have said yes. This week, I am leaning towards the no category.
I'm hoping.
We'll see where I am in a week from now.
I'm hoping. Because just last year, Stacey Abrams, said that if we don't legalize online voting or mail-in voting, then we'll all be speaking Russian, which is part of this whole... Now, we're talking about the speech police. So would the speech police at Twitter or Facebook...
The Cold War called. It's talking
point. Would the speech police ever have a fact check for Stacey Abrams when she said this?
Probably not.
Last year? No. Would they be willing to correct it? No, of course not. It's always on one side. It's never for both sides, which is why I believe in free speech. You just leave it alone and let it happen and let people make up their own minds as to who's telling the truth, and also maybe create critical thinkers in the process.
Yeah, I think you're going to continue to denigrate the trust of the media in the people's eyes. I was listening to Trey Gowdy the other day, who was probably one of my favorite Congress people and just intellectual thinkers, and he was talking about the relationship between the American people and the news network work. And you have half of the country who thinks that the news is this incredibly stand-up organization that can do no wrong, and then the other half thinks that they're terrible and that they can't be trusted. And I think when you start engaging in something where you put the news at like on the cusp of this, national arbiter of truth and whatnot,
Yep.
it's not going to work because you have this festering dynamic with the American people where half of the United States already thinks the news is out to get them. And they're going to see instances where they believe that the news is out to get them, and they're going to further reinforce their point.
It's very true. And Stacey Abrams, of course, I just want to make this clear. She is a graduate of Yale, right? So she's a very smart person. She knows what she's doing when she says things like there is massive voter fraud and there's voter suppression. She knew what she was doing because she's trying to gin up the vote. There's no doubt about it. By telling people that that the Jim Crow laws still exist, which they do not. And it's such a misrepresentation. It's just an outright lie, really. We have a clip of Stacey Abrams, and I want you guys out there in podcast land to decide, well, should the speech police say that this should be illegal, that you can't say this? I would argue she should be able to say it, even though it's, of course, an outright lie. And here is the clip.
Vote. But I have a sense of agency that a lot of folks don't have. If we do not secure our democracy and ensure that every vote counts in 2020, we will be having a very different conversation, possibly in Russian, in 2030. Thank you very much.
So can you imagine that people are actually clapping, going, yes, you're right, we would be speaking Russian in an age when we have our biggest
adversary,
I wouldn't say quite enemy yet, but probably is an enemy too now, is China, not Russia.
Yes. Oh, wow. It's funny because, like you said, that's deliberate, though. I mean, obviously, anybody in their right mind would pick China as our, predominant enemy in the global hegemonic space. But, this is coordinated. This is a methodical point of view,
It really is.
Because the narrative, again, surrounding Trump is, Russia. Russia owns him. He is a Russian asset, et cetera, et cetera. And by saying, we could possibly be speaking Russian, it's, saying that we need to enfranchise voters to make the right choices so that we don't have a Russian nation.
Yes, and of course, it would be helpful if the media, the mainstream media like MSNBC and CNN, CBS, ABC, NBC, if they actually called her, Stacey Abrams, out on this, because
but they don't.
This person could be vice president.
She gets a glowing review and, gets compared to runway models and, can do no wrong.
Shrimp bear, like
Meanwhile,
Wendy's.
she's got the policy experience of a House minority leader in a state predominantly Republican. It'd be like if you went and picked the bluest blue state you could find and took their Republican, minority leader and made them vice president.
It's true.
What have they actually really done in terms of actual policy achievement?
Oh, she's achieved absolutely nothing other than, she's achieved a degree from Yale, which is impressive, but that's it.
I would be as critical if a Republican picked, a similar figure simply because of, media profile. Put her on the debate stage, and I'm sure she'll say good things. But it's like when it comes to actual policy perspectives, I don't know that it accomplishes much. We all lambasted Joe Biden because we don't like Joe Biden for political reasons. But when Obama picked him, he probably picked the most qualified policy person that he could have in the Democratic Party. 30 years, chairmanship of several prominent committees, and whether we agree with him politically or policy-wise, he still had experience.
Yeah, I'm not sure about Joe Biden's intelligence from the standpoint of policy. I think
he's wrong all the time.
In terms of knowing how to pass policy, he knew how the system works because of his longevity in the United States
But that's what
Senate.
you should go for when you're picking somebody like a vice president,
Perhaps, yeah.
But I think, but we talk about this, but I think the dynamics now are a lot different. Obama was somebody who needed somebody from the collective group to support his run. I think Biden needs somebody from the Obama camp or that.
Probably so.
To gin up the base.
With Stacey Abrams, here's why we played this clip, because it was from last year, but she knew what she was saying was wrong.
Oh yeah, very methodical.
We played this clip because, and this is one of the reasons we're doing this podcast, because of the fact that we at Mark and the Millennials do believe in free speech.
Yeah.
And your ability to say what you want in social media, the ability to say what you want out in public, the ability to express your opinion in writing, and orally, and wherever you want to. But the thing is, there are consequences for what you say naturally,
Yes.
and you have to accept those consequences. And you have the ability to do good with your speech, do bad with your speech, just like we talked about earlier with Donald Trump.
Yeah.
And the fact of the matter is, we have a mainstream media that doesn't want to allow free speech. They want to have speech police and determine, what is appropriate and what isn't. And so get this, podcast listeners, talk about free speech and talk about policing free speech. The governor of New York, Governor Cuomo, as you know about the nursing home
America's
debacle,
governor.
the nursing home debacle in New York, where thousands of nursing home patients died because positive COVID patients were allowed to be admitted into nursing homes, thus infecting all the patients in the nursing, or many of the patients in the nursing homes. Well, New York actually had a policy that made that possible. And so the policy was in writing, and it was on the New York State website. Get this, the New York Department of Health has apparently deleted it. And the March order, which was issued by Governor Andrew Cuomo that forced nursing homes to admit COVID positive residents, has been taken down. And the order, which was implemented on March 25th, stated that no resident shall be denied readmission or admission to a nursing home solely based on a confirmed or suspected diagnosis of COVID-19, and also prohibited nursing homes from requiring testing prior to admission or readmission. But the order is no longer visible. It's no longer visible online. So get this, I want to say this again. Prohibited the nursing home, Garrick, from testing an individual to make sure they did or did not have COVID before admitting them. In other words, you're literally letting people into the nursing home and infecting everybody in the nursing home.
Without knowing whether they were... Now, is this rule is probably, I'm assuming it's still in effect, but they just took the information from it down on the website?
No, it's no longer in effect.
No longer in effect?
Yeah,
Good.
because first they took it out of effect, and then they realized, oh no, the order is still on the website. We got to take that down.
Yeah.
Because once again, this is part of the whole policing free speech, right? It's part of our job is to report what is happening, and the other part of the job is to report the fact that government loves to lie.
Yeah.
And here's an opportunity, here's an example where government is lying and they're literally trying to erase any part of history and responsibility. It's disgusting. I mean, it's very Orwellian.
Yeah, I mean, I think one of the things that we're talking about is who should be the person who does the policing of speech. I think while we're talking about the freedom of speech and the arguments with that, I think the overarching thing is who should be doing it. And obviously, from what we've been talking about, the media can't do it, government can't do it, shouldn't do it. The courts, it's not what it's set up to be.
That's right.
So who should we allow to be the arbiter of speech? And I think it's up to each of us. And I think as a collective society to come up with these things and make informed decisions about the consequences that should be in place for certain speech.
But it's also up to us in the podcast world, but also the mainstream media and others in the media to be able to hold Governor Cuomo accountable for really what I see as, I think I see this differently than others. When you knowingly admit COVID patients to nursing homes, that's murder, in my opinion. That's murder. I don't know how else you would call it. What else would you call it? I mean, the government has been culpable in murder in New York State and also in New Jersey and I'm sure elsewhere. Look, in our own state of Maryland, we've had issues in nursing homes.
Yeah,
and
across the country, nursing homes are the biggest place that this happens. I mean, it's like the biggest social risk is being in a nursing home.
It's just fascinating that those weren't the first places. So get this, podcast listeners. So the press attacks Secretary McEnany. She is the secretary of, she's the press secretary, of the President of the United States. And she's quite impressive, to say the least. And they basically attack her because she is up there in front of the press corps talking about the president's order to say all churches need to be open, based on the First Amendment, of course, and your right to assemble as well. And the fact of the matter is the press just goes crazy with this. They just go crazy. We're going to talk about the implications of the president's order, but also of the press itself, which is trying to use the health crisis of COVID to determine that people cannot go to church. Meanwhile, you can go to Walmart. So we have a clip on this. Here is the clip.
In a safe fashion.
The governor does not allow that. Does the White House support churches defying these executive orders?
The president's been very clear. He wants to see churches reopen in accordance with his guidelines.
The answer is yes.
I gave you an answer. The president would like churches to reopen and do it in accordance with the
What
guidelines.
specific provision of federal law allows the president to override a
The
governor's
president will
Smart
strongly
ass
encourage every
answer.
governor to allow their churches to reopen. And boy, it's interesting to be in a room that desperately wants to seem to see these churches and houses of worship stay
The
closed.
president said
Yes,
that he
yes.
has that.
Haley, I object to that. I mean, I go to church. I'm dying to go back to church. The question that we're asking you and would like to have asked the president and Dr. Birx is it safe? And if it's not safe, is the president trying to encourage that, or does the president agree with Dr. Birx that people should wait?
Jeff, it is safe to reopen your churches if you do so in accordance with the guidelines, which are laid out very stringent detail here.
So there you go. Speech police, okay? I object to that, which is what the reporter said. I object to that. That is not the function of reporting. The function of reporting is not to object to what is being said in a free speech environment. The purpose of reporting is to report what is said.
Yeah.
And then report that accordingly. You can certainly ask a follow-up question, but once again, they're trying to be part of the news. I object to that. What does it have to do with reporting? Who cares if you object to it? By the way, if you object to it, then don't go to church. All right? And here's the thing. Why is it okay that you can go to Walmart, go to Home Depot, go to your local grocery store amongst hundreds of people at the same time? And I can tell you right now, the Walmart that I live by, they don't have limits of how many people can go into Walmart. There's no one outside counting how many people are in and out. They could care less. Right? I don't even see people cleaning the shopping carts anymore, right? And you're walking through with a shopping cart or with, one of those carry-on shopping thingies. But the fact of the matter is, that's okay, but you can't go to church, you can't social distance in church. And by the way, Mr. Reporter, no one's making you do it. Don't go to church.
From that context, I thought it was interesting. So I don't know what might have predated the argument between the two of them, but I thought it was interesting that
It was
somehow
the president's order.
because the president wanted to see churches open in accordance with CDC guidelines. That suddenly that meant that you have to define you have to go against governor's executive orders and defy governor's wishes with things like that, as if somehow the president urging churches to be allowed to reopen is suddenly some, defiant order against America's governors.
It's just fascinating to me that press conference, I'm just glad that it actually happened in real time, that it was filmed, it was recorded, so that this should be in every civics class in America, by the way, and it should be in every civics class starting in middle school. That press conference right there. Because it's a violation of your First Amendment, it's a violation of your ability to freely assemble, and it's against common sense where you can go and make your own decision. No one is saying, I'm going to twist your arm behind your back and force you to go to church. You don't have to. It's not required of you to do so. But we should also be teaching people in middle school that here's a reporter saying, well, I object to that. Who cares what you object to? You're a reporter. Yeah. Shut up and just basically report what you're listening to and what you're hearing to. Follow up with a question. Instead of saying I object, say, well, what specifically makes you think that people can go back to church? And she answered it like 10 times. She said it's the CDC guidelines. As long as churches follow this, everything will be fine.
Yeah, it's like reduced capacity. Everybody wears masks. You keep some space between people. And if you can hold your church services outside, that's probably better for you. And it's not an unreasonable or unattainable guideline to follow the CDC in order to open up their churches. And I think it's up to each church to also decide that's something they want to do. My grandmother is very religious. She goes to church every Sunday and Wednesday, and her church doesn't meet in person. They meet through Facebook. And,
Absolutely.
There's technology out there that allows them to hold services the way that they want to. But there are certain churches where, internet-based, service is less than reliable. And, so their community wants to go in person. And it should be, attainable for them. And
let me ask you something. Why is it any less likely that you, when inside of a Walmart, are going to get COVID than when you are inside of a church?
that's been my biggest consistent gripe with, I think, the whole orders is the inconsistency in application across spectrums. They list it as an essential place because you can buy food and they're a big box store, but
and you can buy clothing and you can buy
My
whatever.
problem though is why is it essential when you buy it at Walmart, Target, or Lowe's or Home Depot, but it's not essential when I go to my local mom and pop hardware store or my local small business clothing store, and it's unfair. It's the government picking winners and losers, and something that I personally am not a fan of. And I would hope that most Americans would understand that it is detrimental to small businesses that are owned by average everyday Americans, and not the Walmart family who are billionaires and they'll live quite comfortably after this regardless.
But that was classic Secretary McEnany there, the press secretary of the President of the United States, whereby the media is basically calling her out as the speech police, and they're saying, you can't say that, you shouldn't be talking about that, people shouldn't be allowed to go back, we should be, they're not saying we should ban what you're saying, but effectively if they had their druthers, they would be banning everything that she says because they don't want people to be free and to go back. The media doesn't. The media is so invested in our economy flopping and people being unhappy and going to the polls and being angry, and therefore voting out this president, they will do and say anything. And it's so blatantly obvious to me.
There are a lot of people who I've seen that are a little uncomfortable, because I think McEnany is a very different dynamic than Spicer and Huckabee Sanders and how that they handled the media. As I think Huckabee Sanders being the longest tenured one.
She's Trumpian, for starters.
Yeah, Huckabee Sanders would never really quite argue with the media the way that McEnany does, but I think McEnany is the embodiment of several decades of conservative views of the media in a Trumpian style.
That they're crooked.
A lot of Republicans have always felt that the media is out to get them and that their perspectives were always uncounted because they were conservative, and that no matter what they said, it was incorrect simply because there was an R next to their name. And you get somebody like McEnany who pushes back, and there's a lot of people that I've seen that are very uncomfortable with that, but especially in the media and a lot of old school conservative writers who I follow, but to me, I think it gets lost on a lot of people that this is the way half of Americans in the political sphere feel about the media, whether right or wrong. I think if that's how they feel, then they have a right to feel that way.
It's good to be really skeptical of the media. Yeah. It's good that the media is very skeptical, of elected officials.
Yeah.
The skepticism is very uniquely American, and it's a good thing.
Yes.
And critical
Hold
thinking
your institutions
is a good
accountable
thing.
And think about it critically. And there's certainly ways to do that, but when you start seeing what you believe to be a perceived bias, and that perceived bias kind of is pretty evident to a lot of people in characterizations of certain political philosophies, you get things like this. It eventually was going to denigrate to this point, and it wasn't a matter of if but when.
Yep, but she's doing a great job. Kudos to her because Secretary McEnany,
she does her job very well for what is asked of her.
She does a great job, and I don't see the issue of going back to church. I don't see the problem of people going back to church or going back to temple or going back to mosque. However you decide to worship your God, you should be able to do it.
Yeah.
And the fact of the matter is, if you don't want to,
you don't have to go.
You don't have to. How many times do we have to say that?
Yeah.
But I just wish.
Find the solution that works best for your church.
Yes, or works best for your own particular health and unique health situation.
Yeah.
So next up, we have the dumbest bill in America. It's the dumbest bill in America. And do we have a lead up, Mr. Assistant Producer? Yep. Here it is. Dum 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 dum. And it's the dumbest bill in America, and it is banning the term Chinese virus.
Wuhan flu, Kung flu.
You can't say Chinese virus.
Chinese virus, Mark. Let's keep saying it for effect.
If the bill were to pass, it would be a hate crime to say Chinese virus or Wuhan virus or the Kung flu. You couldn't say any of those terms. In other words, banning free speech. The speech police are going to be out there saying, oh, you said Chinese virus, you said Wuhan virus, you said Kung flu, so therefore it's a hate crime and it's a crime.
Oh,
it's a crime. God. You're gonna go to jail. I mean, so guess who put this bill in?
Coppola.
Senator Kamala Harris.
Kamala.
Democrat of California, who, by the way, might be chosen
As a VP.
VP candidate with Joe Biden.
She's my betting odds favorite.
I think she's going to be chosen too. She introduced a bill last week that would malign people as racists for using the term Chinese virus, Wuhan virus, or Kung flu, connecting it to hate crimes. Its Senate Resolution 580 condemns all forms of anti-Asian sentiment as related to COVID-19, citing Chinese virus, Wuhan virus, and Kung flu as inaccurate rhetoric perpetuating anti-Asian stigma. The bill calls on public officials to denounce such rhetoric in any form. It also calls on law enforcement, can you imagine?
Oh,
it
boy.
calls on law enforcement officials to investigate, document, and prosecute the perpetrators of hate crimes against Asian Americans. Let me tell you something.
What a bill.
Let me tell you something. This has got to be the dumbest bill so far this year because
We've had some dumb ones.
We've had some really dumb ones like, banning leaf blowers in Illinois. But this one is really dumb because, and I want to make something clear to podcast listeners, please don't call us and please don't email us saying, well, there are crimes against, or there's backlash against Asian Americans because of the fact that the Chinese allowed this virus to get out and it's caused many, many hundreds of thousands of people across the world to die and it has killed them. We don't condone people going after Chinese Americans or the average Chinese citizen or any Asian American or any Asian citizen to try to hold them accountable.
Our gripe here is not with the Chinese people, but the Chinese Communist Party.
It's the Chinese Communist Party.
And that is what we're inferring, or at least I believe a lot of people are inferring.
We're
when
all
they
inferring
say,
that, yes.
The Chinese flu here. We're talking about, the Chinese Communist Party who absolutely abdicated.
Say it again. Chinese virus.
The Chinese communist virus,
Sorry, Kamala, it's the Chinese virus.
It's just...
And, here's the problem. So many of these viruses, and so many have come out of China, in part because of the lack of hygiene, right? The lack of standards, and also, in this particular case, because of probably, in my opinion, evil intentions of the Chinese government. I'm not really necessarily sure they're studying these viruses because they're trying to solve them and trying to create cures, or whether they're studying them because they're trying to use them to hurt the rest of the world in case of some sort of war or what have you. But the fact of the matter is that in a free society we have to be able to call out things what they are, and maybe the answer is to be careful. Is when you say the Chinese virus, say the qualification, and the qualification would be what, Garrick?
The Chinese Communist virus.
Yeah, the Chinese Communist virus. And we feel bad for the Chinese people. Or just say the Chinese virus and the Wuhan virus, and say, and oh, by the way, we want to make clear that in communist countries, it always seems like death is what always follows, and it's the communists that have caused this to happen.
Look, if you're somebody who doesn't want to eat Chinese food because in America because you're worried you're going to get the flu or whatever.
The Kung flu, right.
Kung flu, I'm sorry, you're kind of an idiot. But,
you are an idiot, I agree,
but,
yes.
Our gripe, when we'll say it again, my gripe is not with anybody. Look, if I could, I would walk into Beijing tomorrow and liberate the whole world if I could, from the Chinese Communist Party. But that is unfortunately not what we can do. We have to, play a long game with them where we essentially engage in, power warfare in terms of who's an economic powerhouse, as well as, who can express their power in the best ways. And one of the ways we do that is by putting blame on certain entities for causes that they created, and this is just one of them. Isn't
this also like, though, in Iran, when you say the mullahs in Iran, and you say, well, the Iranians are, terrorists, and they're wreaking havoc in the Middle East.
We're not talking about the millions of peaceful, people caught underneath the totalitarian regime. We're talking about the government. We're talking about the power structure.
A government who has hijacked the entire society, and that's what we see. And likewise in China, we have the Chinese communists who have hijacked an entire country, and basically, the country is subject to this basically surveillance state that decides that transparency doesn't matter, and it's worth it that a few 100,000 people, I'm sure probably more than that by now, have died across the world because, they were
so worried about their public image and self-concern that they just, let it all go.
Yeah.
And here we are dealing with the fallout and probably the single biggest economic event in the last 100 years.
Can I ask you something? I really feel like it's your generation. I really feel like it's the millennial generation that is so concerned about hurting someone's feelings by saying something like Wuhan virus or Chinese virus, that you guys were all raised in school that you have to be really sensitive to other people's, and of course in the boomer generation we're like, I'm sorry, we like to say things the way it is. And so what am I missing? Is that true with your generation?
Well, yes, but we could have a whole podcast debate on how I think we got to the point that we did with the millennial generation.
We'll do that, believe me.
We will do that, I'm sure. But that is a whole, I could talk about that for hours. But you are right. I think in my generation is predominantly, it's cliche and it gets talked about a lot, and I think a lot of people lend certain credences to it. But I think overarchingly, I think my generation is very worried about offending the wrong people and, maintaining this, I hate to use the word, but I'm going to use it, this woke apparatus. And, you get things like this where, a bunch of people are like, how can you say that this is the Chinese virus? You're inherently racist for saying such a thing. Whereas I don't think anybody here is referring to the Chinese people like, the common citizens. We're talking about a government that allowed what should have been a relatively mild, virus explode into this global pandemic out of their own inept, response.
See, my thought, that's interesting, because my thought process is the reason why we should call this the Chinese virus is simply because the more we do so, the more likely it is that the Chinese people across the world, wherever they may live, because there are many millions of Chinese who live outside of China as well, but also inside of China, will take responsibility and say, you know what, I don't like how we have been characterized. I know it's the Chinese communists who have caused this to happen, so therefore I want to elicit change in my own country and with my own people in a way that is positive so that we don't have a communist country that is running our country anymore. To me, that is the right thing. And I also have one interesting story that I want to say. In the second week of March, I was still in session in the legislature in the state of Maryland, and I walked downtown and I went to a Chinese restaurant, and I'm not going to say where, and which proves to you I could care, to me it doesn't matter which restaurant you go to. You don't hold people accountable because they happen to be Chinese and they own a Chinese restaurant.
I'm not holding the Maryland Chinese restaurant
Exactly, that'd be absurd. So I went there, I was hungry, so I ordered, you could only order carryout, of course, because things were being shut down very rapidly at that point. And so, and they weren't shut down completely yet, so it was still the last, minute of carryout. So me and several others with me, we went and we got carryout, and I asked, it was all Chinese individuals, I know that for a fact, and I asked the guy who's the owner or the manager, I'm not sure which, and I said, let me ask you something. We're hearing all these rumors about COVID and how bad it is in China, which is why we're getting ready to shut down our state and probably our country. Can you tell me, how many people in China have died from this? He said, oh, only 5. And I looked at him, and he had like a smirk on his face when he said it. And I said, look, I just want you to know something. I'm not an idiot. There's no way that only 5 people have died if an entire city of 11 million people in China has been shut down, utterly shut down.
Welded into their houses.
Welded into their houses, starving and dying inside their own houses. Please, there has to be more to this story. Oh no, it's only 5 people, and everything is opened back up again, is what he said. And so there was a takeaway from this, right? The takeaway is I'm the one that's there with an open mind, and I'm the one that's there getting Chinese carryout, which I love Chinese food, I do. But I'm having this conversation, trying to get information, and literally there's like a lack of transparency. Like, what does he think I'm going to do? This guy's an American citizen. I mean, all I'm trying to find out is what's going on, so I know what to expect here.
Yeah. So it's interesting because you mentioned.
Oh, let me just qualify something.
Yeah.
I'm asking him what's happening in China because he had relatives, obviously, in China. And I knew that. That's why I asked the question. So I want everybody to understand. I was asking this to get information, and the dude literally lied through his teeth. Go ahead.
So one of the policies of the United States during the engagements with the Soviet Union was that they would have, Soviet college kids, because we're talking about, how do you convey to the Chinese people around the world that, there's an issue with your government and you should demand reform. And, with the Soviet Union, we had a lot of these college kids come over here and see the greatness that American universities and American society offered, and they would go back to Russia and they'd be like, wow,
I want that.
I want that. There is talk of implementing a similar policy with respect to Chinese, students coming here, except there's an issue in that, the Chinese are much more refined in how they handle, letting certain groups and certain people out of the country, because when you say this, like, they don't have free,
they don't have freedom of movement
like we do here. Where
no
we just
communist country does.
Wake up and leave vote and go over there. Like, you have to go through some, social programming courses, and you have to qualify based on your social score and these other things that allow you to come over here and learn. And a lot of people, from my understanding, Tom Cotton talked about this the other day, and he got rifled by the media for it because typically this comes back to the conversation of the dumb bill, where anything that kind of questions the motives or anything is just outright deemed racist without ever even assessing the claim. And the claim was that a lot of these students come over here and they take our education, and rather than going back and demanding reform, they basically go back and work on behalf of the Chinese Communist Party.
Yes.
And, how do we, and this is going to be a big policy discussion as we go forward, is how do we address a country, address a country that has such glowing influence in the world now, but also is able to maintain, among its own citizens, this aura of, the specter of greatness, where people that are American citizens operating a Chinese store in America might not be, very hostile to, the transgressions of the CCP.
So look, I'm old school in this. We held the Soviet Union accountable because we said the Soviets, we said sometimes we said the Russians, but usually it was the communists is what we would call them out as. We call them the Soviets. And
even when you used another word aside from communists, it had an association. When you said the Soviets, you were talking about the communists, and you knew that.
But the thing is, I think if you were to tell Kamala Harris, who has this dumbest bill in America, to basically ban the term Chinese virus as a hate crime, you couldn't use the term Chinese virus. I think if you said to her, you know what, it's the Chinese communist virus, I think she would still be triggered. And I think she would be triggered because the left, of course, doesn't like to call things what they are.
Yeah.
I mean, this is part of the problem. It's why we call this entire podcast Speech Police. So look, here is one of my favorite comments from Trump, and he said it the way it is, and this is the only way you get change in the world, is to call things out for what they are, especially when communism and socialism kills. And here's Donald Trump calling it the way it is, and by the way, it would be a hate crime if Kamala Harris's bill were to pass. Here it is.
Why do you keep calling this the Chinese virus? There are reports of dozens of incidents of bias against Chinese Americans in this country. Your own aide, Secretary Azar, says he does not use this term. He says ethnicity does not cause the virus. Why do you keep using this? A lot of people say it's racist.
It's not racist at all, no, not at all. It comes from China. That's why. Comes from China. I want to be accurate. Yeah, please, John, please.
The aides behind you. Are you
I
comfortable
have
with this term?
I have great love for all of the people from our country, but as you know, China tried to say at one point, maybe they stopped now, that it was caused by American soldiers. That can't happen. It's not going to happen. Not as long as I'm president. It comes from China.
Yeah, it doesn't come from the Chinese American citizens, as the president said, but as the reporter tried to play gotcha. Obviously, we all know that. It comes from China. That's why it's called the Chinese virus. And if we want to be more clear, we could say the Chinese communist virus or the Wuhan Chinese communist virus. Good old Kamala Harris with your dumbest bill in America. Final thoughts on this?
I think we all know this, I am rarely one to kind of like try and stretch the statements of the president to mean something that they might not ordinarily mean. But I think to anybody listening at home who understands what they're going for here, this is a battle between two superpowers about accountability and in disease, and it is obvious who we're talking about. And, you know, bills like these, while they sound good to a certain demographic that you're hoping to rile up, and it, you know, is one step forward in the race for, you know, progressivism, it is stupid.
I'm not sure about progressivism. Certainly one step forward in basically displacing China in their desire to have world hegemony.
Yep.
So at least that's what I think.
Yeah, I would agree.
Well, that's the final thought for Mark and the Millennials. Thank you for joining Mark the Millennials. This is Mark Fisher. Thank you to our millennial, Garrick Ross, and of course our producer, Adam Katura, and our assistant producer, Christopher Hopkins. Check us out on iTunes, Spotify, YouTube, Facebook, Twitter, and our website. See you next time.